In 2012, I was a high school freshman, and some guy was like, "Do you know what GameMaker is?" He told me it was software to make games, and you didn't even need programming experience. He came to my house, showed me how it worked, and then I started working on my first game. My first game is called Coin Eater, and it's a game about collecting coins to finish levels. Each level has enemies that you have to dodge, until you pick up this item that allows you to throw fireballs at enemies, so now you can kill them. So you might think the game is easy now because you have this fireball attack and you can just basically cheese enemies like in this level. But in fact the levels get more difficult so much that this level I can't even beat it. This guy reviewed my game in 2012. He says pros retro style, cons none. So at this point I had my first game and I was really happy with it. But I knew games weren't actually made with GameMaker. So I googled, how are games made? And that's how I learned C and Java, but I didn't do much with those for a couple of years. For a high school junior project, I created this desktop application using GameMaker that generates math exercises for 8th graders. My last GameMaker project is a meme version of Pong. My first real Java project was to create a cell simulation. The cells are really tiny. If cells don't eat food, they die, and their offsprings get similar stats as their parents. Eventually, one of my friends introduced me to libgdx, and we made this racing game together. So I spent some time learning libgdx because I wanted to get better at using it. I was now ready to make a more advanced simulation, one about fish. So each fish in this simulation is born with two genes, speed and sight. When the fish reproduce, their children have similar stats as their parents, with small variations. Food is scarce and fish need to compete to survive. When I start the simulation, all the fish have genes that are randomized, meaning they have different speed and sight values, but as I keep the simulation running, they tend to evolve in a way that they have better sight and speed stats, which is really cool. This project was supposed to be an RTS with railroads, but the railroad system isn't even working. I also experimented with procedural tree generation. Then I wrote a poem about tree sim and FishEco for a French class. After playing a ton of Minecraft Hunger Games, I was inspired to make a similar game. The idea was a 100-player battle royale with survival elements. 9 months later, I went back and improved the project. This version has much better pixel art because during those 9 months, I definitely improved. Besides a world chat, this version does not actually have more features than the previous version. When I went back to this project, I found a bunch of unused art like perks, weapons, food, and animals. Babble is this local multiplayer battle royale game where you try to push other players outside of the stage. This was my first time using Unity during a 1-week game jam with 4 other people. Since we had a 3D artist on the team, this project looks pretty good compared to a lot of my other projects. And this game is really fun to play with controllers trying to bump your friends out of the stage. The stage has geysers lifting bubbles up, and there's nothing more satisfying than knocking your friends out with a bazoo bubble. I implemented flocking behavior in this swarm simulation. The agents follow my cursor using 3 simple rules that create emergent behavior. The first behavior is separation. This makes the agent avoid collisions. The second behavior is alignment. This makes them head in the same direction. And lastly, cohesion makes them stick together. When we combine those 3 behaviors, it really makes the flock look natural. HexCity is a game I made under 48 hours. Because this was my entry for the Ludum Dare 38 compo. This is a puzzle-based game where you have to place buildings. But each building has requirements on which buildings have to be next to it and which buildings can't be next to it. I have footage from 2017 recording me make this game under 48 hours. A few weeks later, I decided to start working on a sequel to HexCity. I changed the name to Hexpert, and I actually released this game to Google Play for Android. By the way, I'm not supporting this game anymore. The gameplay is really similar to HexCity with the exception that I added a lot more levels. The art was commissioned, so it wasn't by me. In Hexpert, the levels have tiers of completion like bronze, silver, gold, and getting gold and silver is how you make progress in the game and unlock new levels to play. When working on a Hexpert, I needed to create a lot of levels, so I created this external tool called HexEditor. I wanted to make a penguin training and racing game similar to the Chow in Sonic and the game Duck Life. Unfortunately, this project didn't go really far. It's nice to watch the penguins race to the finish line. I made a pirate management game where you have to micromanage your crew on the ship. To prepare a cannon, you first need to pick up a cannonball. Then bring the cannonball into the cannon. Then you need to send a crewmate fetch the rammer tool, then ram the gunpowder inside the cannon. Once that's done, the cannon can be shot. When you did this, you couldn't actually see the sea monsters unless you had a crewmate on the mast. This enables the spyglass, allowing you to see monsters. If you bring someone to the wheel, then you're going to be able to move the ship to avoid obstacles and monsters. Since there's only 2 crewmates on the ship, you have to trade off between having crewmates on the cannons, on the mast, or on the wheel. I experimented with Procedural Island generation. What I did is I generated Perlin noise, and at each time step, I smooth each pixel using a neighborhood average to create this smoothing effect. In this small game, you're monitoring the Twitter feed of the president and the supreme leader. The goal is to prevent a nuclear catastrophe by turning on an electric fence that shields and protects the big red button. The shield uses a battery which is not infinite, so the player has to guess based on the Twitter feed when someone will press the button. When I started my bachelor's, I slowed down on Gamedev, because most of my free time went to the robotics club. Rusty Chip isn't a game, it's a Chip 8 emulator. To create this emulator, I went on Wikipedia and then I scrolled down to the opcodes section and I implemented every opcode into Rusty Chip. Now I can just go online and download any Chip 8 ROM. This allows me to load games like Brick Breaker, Tetris, and Lunar Lander. Final Forest is an RTS with a nut-based economy. Squirrels collect nuts that can be used to defend the forest against invading lumberjacks. Squirrels can go in trees and throw nuts as a ranged weapon. In a desperate situation, you can send squirrels with armor to fight against the lumberjacks. Instead of risking squirrels' lives, we can send wolves to attack, or even bears. The lumberjacks really want to cut down that forest, so they'll start sending chainsaw men and bulldozers. Trade Republic Simulator is a project I made from scratch in C++ using OpenGL. OpenGL is a graphics API where you have to write 100 lines of code just to render a triangle. In this game, I can just walk in a bakery, and then I can observe the baker taking flour, transforming the flour into dough, and then bringing the dough into the oven, and then cooking bread. Even though it's not shown, all the items like the flour, the dough, and the bread are all simulated in the game. This is highly inspired from the Guild 2 Renaissance. There's also a miller that takes wheat from the chest and then grinds it into flour. Forest of the Lost is another Game Jam entry where we're trying to experiment with a horror theme. In this game, you're a detective in charge of finding a lost girl. This girl was lost in the forest and you go into it trying to find clues. Eventually you realize the game is actually spooky, and as you make progress, the enemies are stronger and the game gets darker. The game's main mechanic is that every 10 seconds, the light goes dark, allowing the enemies to move, but also allowing you to see them. So by mentally mapping where the enemies are, it allows you to dodge them. In Galactic Garden, you play as Celestial Chad. In this game, you have to harvest space crops on your asteroid field and then defend your farm against invading technologically advanced crows that are trying to steal your space corn. You can use harvested crops to buy upgrades like new weapons or ship turbo to move faster in your farm and then harvest even more crops. And then you have to defeat the Lord Crow himself. Thanks for making it this far. If you're interested in running the games, you should look at the description. I'll have GitHub links to most of the projects, but I make no guarantee that it will be easy running them.